Well, welcome everyone. For those of you who've been here before, welcome back. And for those of you who've not been here before, welcome. So today we are going to be talking in the fourth of a series of 6 discussions of Christianity for adults. And today we're going to talk about what the Bible really says about wealth and poverty. And it actually says a lot. According to one author, poverty and God's response to it are second only to adultery as the most prominent themes in the Hebrew scriptures, which Christians call the Old Testament. One of every 7 verses in the Gospel of Luke deals with poverty or the poor, as does one of every 16 verses in the entire New Testament. In light of that, it is astounding that there's a relatively few sermons on poverty. So I warn you though, by the time I get through this lecture, you may suspect that Jesus was the first Marxist. So before I talk about what the Bible really says about poverty and poor, I want to briefly talk about what it does not say. So let's go to the next slide. The Bible does not say that following Jesus or believing in God will make you rich, which is the premise of the so-called prosperity gospels espoused by Joel Osteen and others like him. Harvey Cox is a retired professor at the Harvard Divinity School and a well-known and respected theologian. Here's what he writes. He calls the spurious promises of the prosperity gospel assure their followers, quote, that if they contribute generously, they will receive not only salvation and health, but wealth, and not just in this world, but in the next. The message may be spurious, but it works wonders for its proponents. Joel Osteen is an estimated $100 million. In August of 2023, he and his wife bought a 25,000 square foot house in Texas for $27 million. His ministry owns an Airbus A319 said to be worth $80 million. And in South America, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, an early proponent of the prosperity gospel, was the second largest television network in Brazil. So now that we know what the Bible doesn't say about wealth and poverty, let's look at what it really does say. Next slide. Any discussion of what the Bible says must start with the Hebrew scriptures, which, as I said, Christians call the Old Testament. Those writings reflect a view of the poor that was unique in the entire world at the time they were written. As Houston Smith writes, quote, whereas the gods of Olympus tirelessly pursued beautiful women, the God of Sinai watched over widows and orphans. Thomas Cahill, an acclaimed American historian who studied at both Union Theological Seminary and the Jewish Theological Seminary, notes, quote, God is on the side of the small and powerless, not the high and mighty. He writes, quote, constant bias is in favor not of the powerful and their possessions, but of the powers and their poverty. This bias toward the underdog is unique, not only in ancient law, but in the whole history of law. The next one. A number of Old Testament mandates were directed at helping the poor and the hungry survive. Farmers were ordered not to harvest to the edges of their fields, so the poor could glean those fields. Farmers were ordered not to harvest to the edges of their fields. Owners of vineyards were ordered to leave fallen grapes on the ground for the poor to pick up. Every 7th year, landowners left their entire fields and vineyards unharvested, so the poor could get food from them. These provisions in the Old Testament implicitly recognize that the poor were not poor because they were unwilling to work, but instead assumed the poor would work in the fields and in the vineyards if given the chance. Let's go next slide. Leviticus says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. Notice that the idea of helping the poor was so they continue living among those more fortunate. As we will see, that is the key message of the entire Bible regarding the poor. God expects the poor will be respected as equals with those with more resources and will live among them. Equals. For example, Israelite judges were admonished to, quote, not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. For Samuel says he raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap he seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. Proverbs says, quote, whoever mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. Specified atonement offerings of the rich and poor were identical, but therefore within the means of the poorest. So the next slide. By the 8th century BC, the united monarchy of David and Solomon had split into two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah the kingdom to the south. Amos, a prophet, preached that ignoring the poor among them would eventually lead to the northern kingdom of Israel's destruction. Thomas Cahill summarizes Amos's sermon this way: to serve God means to act with justice. One cannot pray and offer sacrifice while ignoring the poor, the beggars at the gates. But more radical still, if you have more than you need, you're a thief. For what you, quote, own is stolen from those who do not have enough. You are a murderer who lives in the abundance that God has taken from the mouth of the starving. It's hard to imagine a more forceful statement of the need to serve the poor. As one recent author writes, quote, the Hebrew prophet's condemnation of the corrupt wealth of his era applies quite dramatically to our current situation. Amos lived in a time of great prosperity, but prosperity built upon corruption and oppression lead to a great and growing inequality. After Amos' writings, next slide.
Can I interrupt for just
Yeah.
a quick second? Dolly was just saying that the slides are not advancing on Zoom. I think that happened the first week too. Did we ever figure out what the tech fix to that?
It's moving now, although we're getting several slides at a time, but it's moving. I'm on slide 7 now.
That's the right one.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Uh-huh.
After Amos' warning, the northern kingdom of Israel was in fact conquered by the Assyrians. Its citizens deported, and 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel disappeared entirely from history. Early in the 6th century BC, Jeremiah, a prophet in the kingdom of Judah who had descended from people from the northern kingdom, believed that his people in the south, were not paying enough attention to what had happened in the north when they ignored the warnings of Amos. He wrote, quote, like cages full of birds, their houses are full of deceit. They become rich and powerful and have grown fat and sleek. Their evil deeds have no limit. They do not seek justice. They do not promise the case, do not promote the cause of the fatherless. They do not defend the just cause of the poor. Should I not punish them for this? Declares the Lord. And in 587 BC, the Babylonians, in fact, conquered Judah and sent its most important citizens, including Jeremiah, into exile. Biblical prophets' message were clear. Nations who long ignore the poor will not long survive. So next slide. After Persia conquered Babylonia and allowed the Jews to return from exile, an unknown prophet, usually known as Third Isaiah, wrote that a coming leader, quote, the Spirit wrote about a coming leader, quote, the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Later generations of Jews took from this statement a prediction of a Messiah, a word that means the anointed. An extraordinary document from Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Messiah Apocalypse echoes this prediction, saying, as you can see at the bottom, the Messiah will heal the wounded and revive the dead and bring good news to the poor. Go to the next slide. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke both report that followers of John the Baptist asked Jesus, are you the one who's to come? Asked about, are you the one, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Notice that Jesus did not say that the poverty of the poor would be eliminated. as with the other misfortunes, but only that the poor receive good news, as the prophet third Isaiah had predicted. Let's go next one. Luke makes clear that Jesus considered himself predicted bearer of that good news. While speaking in a synagogue in Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus repeated the prophecy from Isaiah about a coming leader who would, quote, proclaim good news to the poor, and announced that, quote, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. After Jesus then refused to perform miracles for the residents of his hometown that they had heard he performed in Capernaum, they drove him out of town, and he centered his ministry in Capernaum. And this synagogue in Capernaum is over and earlier when Jesus taught the good news to the poor. So what was the good news? This church of the Beatitudes on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is a short distance from Capernaum, memorialized Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount contains a series of what are often called the Beatitudes, a series of statements that begin, blessed are. The New Testament contains two slightly different versions of Beatitudes. One version in the Gospel of Luke and the other in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew's version, which is quoted most often, Jesus said, quote, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. According to the version in Luke, however, Jesus said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Luke's version is probably closer to what Jesus actually said for a couple of reasons. First, it seems the most likely in light of Jesus' promise to bring good news to the poor. Inheriting the kingdom of God is certainly good news. And second, according to the Gospel of Thomas, which is not in the New Testament, but does include many of the sayings that Jesus found in the Gospels, Jesus said, quote, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. The next slide. And what about the rich? In Luke's version of the Beatitudes, Jesus says this immediately after his statements about the poor inheriting the kingdom of God. Immediately after, the next verse. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. According to Matthew, Jesus said, quote, truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. So the good news of Jesus for the poor was not that they would become rich, but that they would inherit the kingdom of God. As one author writes, quote, the kingdom of God belongs to the poor simply because they are poor. God is revealed as essentially on the side of the poor simply because they are poor. In fact, under the ideal world envisioned by Jesus, the rich would have to become poor, or at least poorer, if they wanted the benefits of that world. Go next slide. For example, when a rich man asked Jesus what it would take to earn eternal life, Jesus told him, quote, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and you'll receive treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. Notice that Jesus did not tell him to sell what he really didn't need, but sell everything you have. Matthew 19:21 and Mark 10:21 repeat the same requirement of selling everything. Jesus told his own followers, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Another time he said, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Jesus proclaimed that salvation has come to Zacchaeus, the tax collector, after he promised to give half of what he owed to the poor. When Jesus turned over the tables of the temple money changers, he was directly confronting the authorities whose commercial practices were exploiting the poor. The next one. Although the teachings of Jesus are often vague about the identity of the kingdom of God that the poor would inherit, it is virtually certain he was not talking only about life in heaven, but life on this earth as well. That's why the Lord's Prayer includes the plea that your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Harvey Cox, the retired Harvard Divinity professor, writes, quote, the Hebrew prophets Jesus himself, in the last page of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, all teach that the kingdom of God is something that happens in and to this world. It was probably because Jesus was advocating a new world order in which the poor would be favored with the rich, that his discussion of the kingdom of God was vague. It was that vision that probably led to his death. And so what would be the status of the poor in the kingdom of God? At the very minimum, they would not be excluded from the lives of everyone else, and we would be treated equally with those with more resources. Jesus made this clear in his teachings. Let's go next. For example, Jesus once said, quote, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. In one of Jesus' parables, the host of a planned banquet that his friends declined to attend tells his servants, quote, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Next slide. But being poor did not relieve the poor of their duties to do what they could do for themselves and others. As we saw earlier, even the poorest were expected to make the atonement offering that was used to support the temple programs. And the story of the widow's mite shows that the poor were expected to make whatever contribution they could to the temple, even if it meant eating into the money they lived on. Jesus encouraged the poor who were sued in court over debts to make the first step of trying to settle the dispute in order to avoid being in prison. So by recognizing the equality of the poor with the rich, Jesus also empowered the poor to act as their equals. Not all of the burden of bringing the poor to the kingdom of God rests upon the rich. The poor have to do their parts as well. Go next slide. As many Christians today fail to recognize, the earliest followers of Jesus were Jewish, and the earliest church was in Jerusalem, led by James, Jesus' brother. Eusebius, the early church historian, wrote this in about 325 AD, quote, Peter, James, and John, after the ascension of the Savior, did not claim preeminence because the Savior especially honored them, but chose James the righteous as Bishop of Jerusalem. Another author writes, quote, the community of believers Jesus left behind became the earliest church headquartered in Jerusalem under the leadership of his brother James. Many scholars today believe that the Epistle of James was written either by James or by one of his followers based on his teachings. As a result, the Epistle of James may reflect more closely than any other book of the New Testament the actual teachings of Jesus. Let's go to the next slide. The Epistle of James contains a number of sayings of Jesus that are very similar to those reported in Matthew, which was probably written later. It is even possible that Matthew obtained some of his teachings from the Epistle of James. Look, for example, at James 5:12. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no, or you'll be condemned. It is almost identical to the words of Jesus quoted in Matthew 5:37 during the Sermon on the Mount. Simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else comes from the evil one. As one author recently wrote, quote, one way of uncovering what Jesus may have believed is to determine what his brother James believed. A Lutheran pastor recently wrote, quote, James is the vital key to the beliefs and teachings of Jesus. The next one. So with the assumption that the author of James was familiar with the teachings of Jesus, let's look at what it says about wealth and poverty. At the very beginning, the author writes, quote, religion that God, our Father, accepts as pure and faultless is this. Look after the orphans and widows in their distress to help keep oneself from being polluted by the world. In words presumably referring to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, James says, quote, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? And for the writer of James, that kingdom meant that the poor would live and worship among the rich, and not be discriminated against. As he said, quote, my brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favorites. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand here or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? As you can see, the author of James, presumably reflecting the teachings of Jesus, expected that the poor and rich would worship together. The word being translated here as meeting is the Greek word for synagogue. Go next slide. It was in this context, the very context that I've just showed, that James famously states, quote, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. That statement is expressly tied to the treatment of the poor. Quote, suppose a brother or sister is without clothing or food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? The statement in James that faith without acts is not sufficient for salvation led Martin Luther to conclude that the Epistle of James is not of equal status with the letters of Paul. In my opinion, that is unfortunate. The statement of James of the needs of Christians to help the poor probably came directly from Jesus. So like Jesus, the author of James had harsh words for the rich and their fate. Quote, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming to you. Your wealth is rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. Again, we can see in these words very similar to those of Jesus in Matthew, quote, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Go next slide. So far, I have not mentioned you what is probably the most often quoted statement Jesus made about the poor, which is found in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. Quote, the poor you will always have with you. That statement is often quoted to justify the idea that, quote, there is nothing we can do about poverty, and the poor will always be there, so why bother? It is often accompanied by the claim that the Bible says, quote, God helps those who help themselves, which is, of course, not in the Bible. In fact, the words of Jesus looked at in context actually summarize virtually everything Jesus said about our obligation not only to help the poor, but also to be among them. First, look at where Jesus was when he made this statement. He was, quote, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper. At that time, lepers were, quote, the worst outcasts of society and among the poorest of the poor. The mere fact that Jesus was in the house of Simon the leper says volumes about his belief that the poor should be included in the lives of Christians. So next slide. So now let's look to whom this statement was directed. It was directed to Jesus' disciples, who were also at the dinner with Simon the leper, the poor outcast. They had scolded a woman for pouring expensive perfume on Jesus' head, saying, well, perfume could have been sold at a higher price than the money given to the poor. So now let's look at the entire statement of Jesus as reported in Mark, the earliest gospel. For the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. As one author writes, quote, Jesus is assuming the social location of his followers will always put them in close proximity to the poor and easily able to reach out to them. In other words, quote, disciples, because you'll always be among the poor, you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. Go next slide. Close proximity with the poor and needy is also required by Jesus' famous parable in Matthew 25 about the coming Son of Man separating the sheep from the goats. Quote, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Virtually all of the acts that Jesus describes as leading to eternal life for the righteous require close contact with the poor, including visiting them and inviting them into homes. Go next slide. The earliest Christians in Jerusalem took these words to heart, living together with and giving to the poor among what they needed. Quote, all the believers, this is from Acts, all the believers were together, and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who have need. In fact, there's some evidence that the Christians in Jerusalem were themselves known as, quote, the poor. Go next slide. Today, as we all know, there is very little interaction between most Christians and those who are poor. As one author writes, we are no longer with the poor, and they are no longer with us. The middle class church doesn't know the poor, they don't know us. Wealthy Christians talk about the poor, but have no friends who are poor. So they merely speculate on the reasons for their condition, often placing the blame on the poor themselves. That same author writes, quote, it is time to reclaim the gospel faith, especially in our public life. When we do, we discover that faith challenges the powers to be to do justice to the poor instead of preaching a prosperity gospel and supporting politicians who further enrich the wealthy. Go next slide. Fortunately, there's some evidence that this and similar calls are being heard and heeded, however slowly. Harvey Cox wrote this in 2009. Worldwide, evangelical movements are moving, changing, and dividing. Many of their leaders who once condemned the social gospel are now searching for a social theology on their own that includes peacemaking, striving for racial justice, and combating poverty. Next slide. In 2013, Pope Francis issued a 47,500 word document called The Joy of the Gospel. Based on the teachings of Jesus and earlier Roman Catholic leaders, it attempts to make the church relevant to today's issues, especially relating to poverty and income inequality. Based on biblical teachings, the document recognizes the need for more respectful interaction between the poor and those of us with more resources. Here's some examples quoted from the document. Our commitment does not consist exclusively in activities or programs of promotion and assistance. What the Holy Spirit mobilizes is not an unruly activism, but above all, an attentiveness which considers the other in a certain sense as one with ourselves. This loving attentiveness is the beginning of a true concern for their person, which inspires me effectively to seek their good. Now, only on that basis, there's real and sincere closeness, and we properly accompany the poor on their path of liberation. Only this will ensure that, quote, in every Christian community, the poor feel at home. Would not this approach be the greatest and most effective presentation of the good news of the kingdom? And again, no one must say that they cannot be close to the poor, because their own lifestyle demands more attention to other areas. This is an excuse commonly heard in academic, business, or professional, and even ecclesiastical circles. In his words on income inequality, Pope Francis expressly invoked these teachings of Jesus. The Pope loves everyone, rich and poor alike, but he's obliged in the name of Christ to remind all that the rich must help, respect, and promote the poor. I exhort you to generous solidarity and to the return of economics and finance to an ethical approach which favors human beings. Notice the emphasis of the Pope on inclusion and respect. Respect for the poor can most easily come from becoming among them and hearing their concerns. Go next slide. Before his death, Rush Limbaugh spent an hour criticizing Pope Francis' words as, quote, pure Marxism. Sarah Palin climbed in that the Pope's remarks, quote, sound kind of liberal, and it's taken me aback. In his criticism, Limbaugh said that someone, quote, must have gotten to the Pope. The reason Aslan, who converted to Christianity from Islam, wrote in response, quote, Limbaugh's right, somebody did get to Francis. It was Jesus. Next slide. 2016 and 18, the General Assemblies of the Presbyterian Church USA, which is this congregation, exhorted congregations to become Matthew 25 churches by, quote, acting boldly and compassionately to serve people who are hungry, oppressed, imprisoned, or poor. Matthew 25 churches commit to one or more of the following: challenging people in congregations to deepen their faith and get actively and joyfully engaged with the community and the world, advocating and acting to break down the systems, practices, and thinking that underlie discrimination, bias, prejudice, and oppression of people of color, eradicating systematic poverty by working to change laws, policies, plans, and structures in our society that perpetuate economic exploitation of people who are poor. Chris Henry, who many of you know, Brian used to work with, is the young senior pastor at Second Presbyterian Church. Even though I am not any longer a member of his church, he and I are good friends, and I admire what he is doing in that congregation. About 2 years ago, he did something courageous. He participated in an afternoon community meeting with his church to discuss the tenant crisis in Indianapolis and made introductory remarks. These were people from the community. He began his remarks by quoting Dr. Peter Story, Methodist bishop in South Africa, who served as chaplain to Nelson Mandela and other prisoners at Robben Island, and spoke to the graduating class of Duke Divinity School, from which Henry later earned his degree. Here's what he said: until you lead your congregation to engage with the real world, your pastoring will be mere pampering. Your proclamation will be a righteous form of talking to yourself. You must resist with all your might the temptation to play church while the world leads. Go next slide. After quoting Jeremiah, Reverend Henry said, quote, Jeremiah condemns people of faith who play church while the world leads. It is time for people of faith in our city, in our state, to join together and say that we stand for justice, we stand for compassion, we stand for equity. For too long, the religious community has silently descended to a definition of morality that is too narrow in scope, called scripture. Economic justice is a core biblical issue. Budgets and bills are moral documents. Speaking directly to those in his audience who were not members of his church, probably never been in the building before, he said, quote, for people of faith to ignore the plight of our neighbors and retreat from working on their behalf is spiritual malfeasance. God asks more of us. So we're here to listen and to serve. We're here because the call of our faith demands that we respond faithfully to the needs of our neighbors. We welcome you to Second Church. Go next slide. Fundamentalism is attractive to some people because purports provide certainty in a world of uncertainty. Because one authorizes religious communities that fulfill the deepest needs, frustrations, and anxieties of the members are likely to survive. Reverend Henry recognized this. He said, quote, there's accompanying appeal to the understanding of spirituality as a retreat from the complexities and struggles of the world. There's safety to be found in insulating and isolating ourselves. But then he adds, of course, this kind of sectarian withdrawal is right at home in the carved up tribalism of our current social political reality. The world is complicated and messy. It's tempting for our people to gather weekly, for most of our folks these days monthly, to pat ourselves in the back for being good people. Keep the rituals, feel good, play church. He said, I have no interest in such an approach to ministry, which is ultimately both fruitless and pointless. That certain and unequivocal statement provides a powerful reason for people to be Christians. They can help change the world for the better, exactly as Jesus taught us to do. In my opinion, the people of Northminster get this. I am proud that Northminster is a Matthew 25 church. That is one of the reasons that Diane and I joined this church. And we see, as we hear that call being lived out in the sermons and the actions after the congregation week after week. In my opinion, this church is living out what the Bible really says about wealth and poverty, and we're glad that we know a part of that. Okay. In 2 weeks, we'll look at what the Bible really says about the return of Jesus. As we'll see, the teachings of Jesus do not have to wait his return to create the kingdom of God on earth that he promised. All we have to do is to follow what he taught when he was here. Questions?
It's big stuff.
In your opinion, why aren't all of the PCUSA churches Matthew 25? How can they not be after hearing something like this?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, Brian may have heard some of these discussions. I think for too long, I'm gonna act like I have a pulpit here.
You did, literally.
For too long, people have believed that being a Christian is based on what you believe, not on what you do. And they're perfectly happy to go to church and say, I believe in God the Father, the Apostles' Creed, and go home and say, I've done whatever it takes to be saved. Those people have never read much of the Bible. They've certainly not read much of what I talked about today, and they've never read Matthew 25. Because if you read Matthew 25, you can't come to that conclusion. You can't come to the conclusion of reading Matthew 25 that all you need to do is believe something. Jesus didn't say a single thing in Matthew 25 about what you have to do, what you have to believe. He said this is what you have to do. Now, Brian, I don't know, you have some opinion as to why this is not catching on throughout the entire Christian world.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the orthodoxy replacing orthopraxy, we believe rightly, and who gets to decide what right belief is? Usually it's people that look like me. Through the history of humanity, that's really been the case. So how do we move congregations, not just congregations, people, toward what does it mean to live this faith, not just believe this faith? And that's a scary proposition that Tony, you hit it right on the head. I mean, it's scarier to think that it's time now to get, it's not just time now, it's been time. It's always been time to get our hands dirty for the sake of the gospel. It's risky, and not just for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of humanity. I think that's where sometimes we get it flipped a little bit, that the God, I'm going to say something here, might get me in trouble. It is really easy to spiritualize the gospel and forget that it's really about humans. It's really about humanity. It's really about who we are as people and the thriving of everyone. I have a friend who's he's written 8 or 9 books on missional theology. And he has a phrase that I love. He said, to sum up missional theology in one phrase, this is how he would do it: to work toward a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid.
Just
I mean, Ned, what could you argue with that? I mean, right? Come on, let's go. Let's do it. I mean, it gives me chills thinking about it. Let's go. Let's make it happen. And that's, Matthew 25 is not the whole, but it is certainly a major part of what it means to be people of faith in the world.
Well,
Yeah.
Brian was talking over dinner about, what I'm really proud of this church, it's trying to become a source where people from the community can come to congregate without regard to their beliefs. The playground does that, the events in this church do that. And it's not a place where you have to say, I can come in the door only if I say I believe what this church believes. You come into this church because you're a human being. And that's the point that Chris Henry was trying to make, those people he invited, says, you're in this church because you're a part of humanity. That's hard for some people to recognize. Because as you know, there are any number of people, probably friends of ours, who believe if you don't believe what they do, you're somehow not in their club. You're not a human being anymore. I had a friend in high school, became a fundamentalist minister, who told his mother he was really sad that she was not going to go to heaven. Really sad. His mother was not going to do that. We have too many, in my opinion, we have too many people who believe that.
I would say too, that there are a lot of churches that act as Matthew type churches, but aren't signed on. There are a lot of small rural churches that are serving their communities, but they're exhausted from signing on to do more and more thing. They feel like that means they have to do something else, but they're really, because I visited a lot of small rural congregations, and they're exhausted, but they're doing great things in their communities.
I think one of the other challenges is when you hear the narrative that's true, that institutions are changing. Many people say dying. I'm not sure they're actually dying. I think they're changing. You can really buy into the premise that, well, then we've got to figure out how to save the institution. And if the institution's doing things that are transformative for the world, you're not gonna have to worry about saving the institution.
The Harvey Cox book is, I think it's a 2009 book. It's a positive book about faith recovery, what it really means. Go back to the teachings of Jesus, back to that it lived in the early days, and do that. And the institution, whether the institution survives, the word didn't survive. That's his. And the book was actually got a really provocative title. The future of faith.
Future of faith. Yeah.
Yes, Deb.
I have a question for you or for anybody. We've talked a little bit about, the Bible's not meant to be taken literally. There's allegory here. How do you take the statement, give away everything you?
I think it's provocative. I think it's meant to be provocative.
I mean, that is a big ask.
It is a big ask. As I said in the, if you'll see in the notes, I said become poor or perhaps poorer.
Mhm.
I think Jesus was pretty provocative in his teachings, right? And the ones that got quoted often were probably the ones that were most provocative. So you can't it's easier for the rich person to go through that and you don't have to get the kingdom. But those are just trying to make people aware of what I'm saying, which is there's an obligation to do something out there as opposed to just taking all your money and hiding it. That's what I think. I think it was provocation.
But if that was really Jesus's intention,
To scare people.
then why? I mean, most of us would say, I can't do that, so now I'm just gonna give up and not do anything.
No, I think his intention was to say you got to be more comfortable with the idea of giving something important, including money. I think that was just a way to shock them. I don't take that statement literally. Give up everything you have.
Well, and he probably was calling out that guy, like what in that person's heart was the most important thing. It's
Yep.
like, because like it seems like he would go to all these people and challenge them on what they essentially idolized. So in that case, the rich man, it was his money, and otherwise his heart wouldn't be set free.
So Zacchaeus, for example, didn't have to give up everything. He just gave up half.
Yeah.
But Jesus' ministry doesn't succeed without wealthy people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that you can verify that. I mean, it's not like there's not a ledger. But people, this is not Jesus, but Paul, Lydia, the seller of purple, was incredibly wealthy. And because she sold purple, that sounds ridiculous to us, but it was the prize. You sold purple to royalty. She was well off. Mary and Martha had a house. That says something about the two of them back then. They owned a home as women, by the way. You know, so there were wealthy people that made his ministry happen. And because without it, he literally has no funding. He has no job that we know of, right?
So I think the answer to Deb's question is, I don't think it's speculative. I think it's not shocking. It's simply shocking.
The thing that struck me too, though, was that really in the end, you can't take it with you. So we all end up with nothing
Right.
when we die. We give it all away, whether it be to our kids or to whatever. So, I mean, thinking now about how am I gonna share that with the world, whether it be today or whether it be.
And by the way, it may not be the important message to everybody, but for me, the important message was to just have those people, have people who are among you. So you can't say
Yeah.
to yourself, the reason they're poor is because, and you don't know the because. Too many people say they're poor because they won't work, because they're lazy. You meet the people who are poor. My father was poor. He was anything but lazy, but he was still poor. And so I think having people who have different levels of income among you is an important part of this. And I know Brian's trying to do that.
I think that lends to the equity piece that you're talking about, where like, I think the most telling point was that the judges treated them the same as the rich.
That's right.
Like, don't show favoritism,
No.
even in the sense of like pity, like show it in the sense of
Be
like,
equal, make them equal.
you are still equal even in the eyes of the law.
If you also look at the socioeconomic distribution of Jesus's time, the pyramid was even more out of whack than it is now. If we can even imagine that, the wealth lived with very few people. Over half the population was either in slavery or indentured servitude. So, you had huge swaths that were living in abject poverty. And so there was zero distance unless you wanted there to be distance, unless you were purposefully ignoring.
I think the image of this verse that comes out, the poor laws be among you, if you put it in context, lepers were among the most despised people of their time because they were thought to be contagious. And you put it in leper colonies and you stayed away from them. Here Jesus has them in the house, goes to their house to show the ability to interact with people of less. So for me, that's one of the important messages. I know this church is trying to do that. I know this church.
In the history of Christianity, when the church has done radical things, that's what it's done. It has moved toward, so hospitals, public schools, public libraries, all of these things that are supposed to be equal access were things that were started by people of faith. And those three institutions, hospitals like we know them now, they're named after saints, right? St. Francis and Ascensions used to be St. Vincent's, and Methodist, Lutheran, they're all named after faith groups. And there's a reason why. Those people sometimes nuns took vows of poverty to work with the poor and work with the sick, work with the dying. They literally put their lives on the line.
Little sisters.
Yeah. Becky, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I think Brian's starting to talk about people of faith communities, starting hospitals, starting schools, starting libraries. I am 100% on board that Jesus told us to be among the poor. I just always don't know how to do it. Like, how do I do that? Like, when I was a young mom, how would I do that without jeopardizing the safety of my young children? Right? Like, I go back to some of the, Mother Teresa, I think, is probably the shining example on the hill, but how on earth do you just give up everything? And spinning that even farther, that may not be what God is calling all of us to do. We may just need to give our, zone bar to the guy on the street that is standing at the stoplight, right? That we have in our car. Or, I know people that keep $5 of McDonald's coupons and just hand them out to people that are begging. you know, what are we called to do? And I think that's what I love about Northminster is that there's a bunch of different opportunities for anybody to get involved at any level. And I, you know, I'm hoping to find something here in Atlanta that's like the Northminster community.
Bet there's Family Promise in Atlanta, which was before the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful families to interact in a very social and safe way. So safe it's even in your own congregation.
Yep.
And Dolly, I don't know if there's any talk about
She's
moving
not.
away from the apartment model.
She's left. She
Oh, she's
left.
off. Okay. I don't know. Did anybody attend? Did you
Yeah,
attend
we were there.
is there any talk of moving away from the apartment model or they're gonna stay with
Deepening the
that? 'Cause
apartment model.
Yeah,
It's what?
They're deepening the apartment model.
they can reach out to so many more families at the same time.
And it's better for the family.
I was gonna say, it's better, I was like, they should do what's best for the families, not what's best for the
It's,
congregation that
they're also
we're
saying-
more people in a way that's comfortable for them.
But I think that's a really great example of there are things that are proximate to us. That we can invest either resources or time into that are doing these acts. One of my big frustrations, if you're around me long enough, you'll hear me say this. The church for a long time, every church would decide they were gonna do the same things. And so every church had a closet food pantry and every church had a, you know, this or this or this. And we were competing with resources that could have been put together to make a bigger impact.
You
So you're
cannibalize,
starting
right? You cannibalize.
to cannibalize each other, absolutely. And you're starting to see churches say, that's silly. We gotta stop doing that. We gotta stop competing against each other. We gotta stop fighting for resources. We gotta start pooling our resources together and start actually making these differences in our community in ways that are really proximate to us. Washington Township is the most impoverished township in Indianapolis. That is a shock to people to hear. Most people would think it was Center Town. It is not Center Township. It is Washington Township. It's our township. And it's actually not even close. Like it's by far the most impoverished. And when you put the statistics together, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like 32% or something like that live actually below the poverty line in Washington Township. And if you add what's called Alice families, which are families that are, they make too much money to qualify for any kind of governmental benefit or support. And they are still at risk of poverty. If you add those, it actually bumps that number to almost 50%. So we're at almost 50% of the families in Washington Township that live either at or below the poverty line or just above, so that they're still at risk. That's astonishing. And it's in our backyard. I mean, not even in our backyard, it's across the street. It's, you know, so there are organizations that Karen and I have been doing some research with, and some members have been doing some research with, where we can continue to not just invest money, but invest opportunity to invest time in our human resources to make a difference, a real difference in the lives of people. So I've talked too much, but one last thing, I always say that before I say another thing. There's one of the things that the church has also done traditionally with the poor you will always have with you is utilize that statement as a way to make nominal difference. So there is a way that we could get to as a culture where we could almost eradicate poverty if we really wanted to. And there's a theologian who's from Northern Ireland that is also flamboyant in the things that he says and does. His name's Pete Rollins, and he compares the church's relationship with the poor to Batman's relationship with Robin, or not Batman's relationship with the Joker, sorry. So Batman, if you know the backstory of Batman and the Joker, Batman actually creates the Joker. And Batman's entire existence revolves around the fact that he needs these criminals in order to justify his own existence. Bruce Wayne, his alter ego, has the money to actually make a big difference, but instead what he does is he builds these really cool vehicles and awesome tools to fight crime, to put them in Arkham and only for them to escape. So there's this interesting play that he talks about where the church has done that too. The church has thrown money at these things without thinking about, and this is a gross generalization, but without thinking about what are the systems that could actually be changed that could make an impact. So one thing that we're both really excited about is Faith in Indiana is an advocacy group, and we are going to do some work with them about that part of this fight too, because there is a portion of this that means advocacy. We have to go and say, we need to change some laws so that people can have access, so that we're no longer fighting an uphill battle. So those are ways that we can get involved and get engaged. Not everybody at Northminster will. Heaven forbid, we don't want everybody at Northminster to do the same thing, right? There are thousands of things that we can do. This will be one. And so that's coming soon. And so we're really excited. I'm sorry, I'm speaking too much for Karen, but we're really excited about some of these network partners, neighborhood partners, real proximate partners that are doing or opening opportunities to make real substantive difference around poverty and also racial justice. And so you'll be hearing more about those in the coming months. And we're not alone. These are things that we're doing with other congregations that are also invested and involved. There's good news.
That's why that's where we're trying to be here.
Yeah, and that's why these kind of classes are so important, because it's because of our faith that we're doing these things. It's because we're called to. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've come to 7 o'clock, and that's what I'm told is the end of this.
So you're saying we're not gonna become an Acts church and all sell our